Shavua Tov, the Torah tells us a very sad story on a very joyous occasion. It was the dedication of the sanctuary that they had worked so hard, the Israelites had worked so hard in the wilderness to construct, a glorious structure to house the divine presence. And at the critical moment when the fire was to come out of heaven and consume the sacrifices on the altar on this unique day in history, the two sons of the beloved high priest, Aharon and Kohen, made a decision to bring their own fire to the altar, and as a result, the fire came out from heaven and they were consumed. And, well, the Torah says quite clearly they brought a fire that they were not commanded to bring, and you can interpret the verse to mean that they were commanded not to bring, but the simple reading is they were commanded, that they were not commanded to bring. Basically, they took an initiative, and tragedy then marred this day of jubilation. And it seems pretty straightforward what their sin was, and yet the rabbis, many different rabbis, offered different explanations for what their sin was, some of them which seem to have absolutely nothing to do with the story as recorded in the Torah. Why so? What was their sin, if it was a sin, and why this punishment, if it was a punishment, and what are we to learn from it? Well, let's take a look at the explanations. There are three main thrusts among commentators. One thrust is that this was an error. Simply put, an error. They didn't understand that they were supposed to wait, that on this particular day fire was coming down from heaven, and with all good intentions, they thought they were supposed to light a fire and bring it to the altar to move things along, and therefore they were punished for the error. You might ask, why such a strong punishment for an error? The answer is possibly that when you have a position of responsibility, and the responsibility for the entire people rests upon your shoulders, well then in such a case there is no room for error. They are not supposed to make errors like that, because the entire people then falls down. And well, we can go with that, or we can add a little bit of enrichment to that particular approach. The second approach is that they weren't punished at all, that it wasn't necessarily an error, it was an excess of love, an excess of holiness. In other words, Nadav and Avihu needed to cleave to God so much so that the intense spirituality and holiness inside of them didn't allow for them to remain alive as physical beings. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the one who brings this approach, and it is implicit in a Rashi who says that when Moses was comforting Aaron, he says to Aaron, this is what God means when he says, Bikrovaya Kadesh, with those who are close to me will I be sanctified. That Nadav and Avihu, says Moses to Aaron, were even holier than you and me. How can you say that if they commit a sin and they get punished? The answer is maybe it wasn't a sin, maybe it was an excess of holiness, and their bodies could not contain such powerful spiritual energies. We have a similar thing when God gave the Ten Commandments. After the first commandment, which the people heard from God's mouth himself, as it were, their souls were so overwhelmed with holiness that they sought to leave their bodies, and God put it back in. It happened again with the second of the Ten Commandments, and then after that happened, the people said to Moses, all right, this is already risky. We don't know if this is going to keep happening. Each time God speaks, our souls are going to leave the bodies. Is he going to keep putting it back in? Maybe he won't. Maybe we'll just die here. So it's better, Moses, if you talk to us. God talks to you, you talk to us, and then everything will be resolved. Sorry, I got to move the chair. And so that's what happened. So this may be a similar instance of that. The third thrust among the commentaries seeks a background sin. There must have been some guilt there, and they give different explanations. One explanation is that they did not consult with Moses, that they taught the halacha, the law, in front of their teacher Moses, which is disrespectful. When a student is in the presence of their rabbi, they are not supposed to answer questions. They are supposed to refer people to the rabbi. And, well, I think that a very simple practical explanation would be that Nadav and Avihu should have asked Moses, should we bring this fire or not? Instead, they made the decision on their own without consulting. And had they consulted, very simple, cause and effect, Moses would have said to them, no, do not bring the fire, and then the whole thing would not have happened. So that explanation actually kind of works for me. So it wasn't that was their sin, it's that they made that mistake, that they didn't get the right answer and they made the wrong call. But there are others who seek background sins, such as the fact that they were not married, they did not have children, One explanation is that they were inebriated, that they had had alcoholic beverage and they were in a state of drunkenness. I don't know if real drunkenness, but they were, excuse me, at least a little bit dimmed, shall we say. That explanation is a little bit difficult as well, because the prohibition for a Kohen, for a priest, to do the service in a state of inebriation comes after this happened. Right after the whole story with Nadav and Avihu, then God speaks to Aaron and says, don't drink wine or beer before you enter the sanctuary to do the service. So how could Nadav and Avihu be punished for that if the prohibition had not yet been told to them? It wasn't yet a sin, as it were. This is like closing the barn door after the horses have escaped. In general, it's a difficult thing to say that there is some kind of a background sin, because first of all, if the background sin of maybe not being married, not having children, or not being respectful to Moses, whatever it might be, and there are a number of explanations. If the background sin is of such a level that they deserve the death penalty, so then why did it have to be activated by them bringing the incense, the strange fire? They should have been punished anyway. And even more so, the Torah seems to refer to them as being close to God. I think we mentioned that the verse that Moses says to Aaron to console him, he says that God is going to be sanctified by those that are, quote, close to me, bikrovai, and they are even holier than you and me. We mentioned that earlier. So how can you then say that they were sinners, and yet you're saying they were holier than you or me? So on a tangent, I will say that there is a very important lesson in this, and that is that Judaism does not accept cancel culture. What is cancel culture? If somebody said something that I disagree with, it's politically incorrect, it's this or that phobic, whatever it is, or they did something really true that was bad, whatever it might be, therefore they have to be canceled. I don't want to hear from them anymore, I don't want to see them anymore, they have no right to work, they have no right to a livelihood, blah, blah, blah. We hear all of this all the time. Perhaps we're learning here an important lesson, and that is, you know what? You don't judge a person by their mistakes and by their weak character. You judge them by their heart. And if their heart wants good things for them and for the world, then that is how you and I judge them. God deals with the sins, that's his province. But as far as our relationships to others, we should not be coming with a microscope, but rather we should see, is this a person who wishes good? And perhaps even somebody who has some background sins is capable of tremendous holiness, even more, says Moses, than you and me, as he said to Aaron. And this reminds me of King David. King David is the sweet singer of Israel. It is his psalms that accompany us throughout life. He put into words every aspiration and hope and dream of every member of the Jewish people and humanity, to be quite honest. And the Psalms are therefore balm to our souls. And yet King David, if you read through the prophets, through the stories, he occasionally does some bad things and gets rebuked by the prophets and gets punished by God. And yet he remains the sweet singer of Israel because his heart was entirely connected to holiness and entirely connected to the Jewish people. And so warts and all, and there is no person who is perfectly righteous who does not have some warts, who does not have some sins. The rabbis say this. Warts and all, his overwhelming and overpowering holiness and connection continues to inspire us to this day. And perhaps we are learning that Nadav and Avihu, despite those flaws, they still were exceedingly holy. And that's an important lesson to right away to negate the whole cancel culture. However, I wish to take this a little further and take a look at a few other incidents that happened in our history which may shed light on this situation. The first one is mentioned in the Haftarah. In the Haftarah, we hear again of a joyous occasion. The Ark of the Covenant, which had been captured by the Philistines, was now being returned. It was coming in a wagon, and King David was dancing, and everybody was dancing and rejoicing. And then, right in that celebration, tragedy struck. A man named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark because the animals pulling the cart had shaken it loose. And so Uzzah wanted to prevent it from falling. Now, you might think that's a responsible thing to do. We can't let the holy ark fall. And yet God gets angry at Uzzah, and Uzzah dies. And this bothers King David a lot. What exactly was Uzzah's sin? It seems to be the fact that the rabbis chose this as the Haftarah, excuse me, for the parsha. We didn't read it today because today was a special maftir, so we read a different Haftarah. But had this just been Parshat Shmini, that is the story that we would have read. To draw a connection, because there also it was a day of joy and somebody went a little too close to the holiness. As a matter of fact, the verse which refers back to the story of Nadav and Avihu, which we'll read in a few weeks, is very puzzling. The beginning of the parsha, Acharei Mot. It says, behold, after the death of the two sons of Aharon, Bekorvatam lifnei Hashem vayamutu, as they came close to God and they died. Is that why they died? Because they came close to God? Why doesn't it say there, Bahakriva mesh zara vayamutu, that they brought a foreign fire and they died? Tell me the sin. But yet it says they came close to God and they died. We need to understand exactly what does that mean. Another case with an opposite result is the case of Pinchas. Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron, the nephew of Nadav and Avihu, he sees a prince of Israel take a Midianite woman in front of the entire camp and cohabit with her. Aside from the modesty issues, this is considered a rebellion against God. It's intermarriage and it's leading towards idolatry. And Pinchas doesn't ask any questions. He picks up a spear, he runs and he kills them. And what does God do to Pinchas? He rewards him. So here, Pinchas took action and he gets rewarded. Uzzah took action and he was punished. Nadav and Avihu took action. They didn't see the fire coming down yet. And they brought their own and they get punished. What's the difference between them? Another story in the Megillah of Esther. Here we have Esther is queen. Mordechai has found out about Haman's plot to kill the Jews. He urges Esther to go to the king and beg him to remove and nullify the evil decree. Esther demurs. She's afraid. I can't go. The king is extremely paranoid. Anybody who walks into his room, he has killed. And I haven't been unless he reaches out his scepter and accepts them. And I haven't been called in a month. The king seems to be angry with me. And therefore it's risk of life and limb if I go in there. And Mordechai says to Esther the following, and pay attention to it. He says, don't imagine that you will survive by just being in the king's palace. You should know that salvation and rescue will come to the Jews, Revach v'hatzalah yamdu liyudim, no matter what. Ve'at uvet avich tovedu, and you and your family's house will perish. In other words, you need to be Pinchas. You need to take action. And if you don't take action, you'll perish. The exact opposite. Why doesn't Esther say, well, if the salvation is going to come, then you don't need me to risk my life and limb? Mordechai doesn't give her that option. I mean, he tells her that will be the consequence. But he doesn't give her that option. Why not? The important distinction is the following. That a Jew who comes to fix God, not acceptable. God does not need us to fix him. Nadav and Avihu came to fix God, as it were, to bring that fire to help God out in his sanctuary. Not necessary. And by the way, I would say that the question that a detective would ask when encountering a dead body, was this a homicide or an accident, can be paraphrased with Nadav and Avihu. Was this a punishment or was it an accident? And I think you could say plausibly that it was an accident, because Nadav and Avihu attempted to become too close to God. And therefore, when the fire, which was going to come forth from heaven anyway to consume the sacrifices, came down, they were simply in the way. And perhaps that's the explanation of the verse in Acharei Mot, that after the death of Nadav and Avihu, Bekorvatam, that they brought, that they came too close to God and they died. In other words, they were in the way. Because when it comes to God in this world, God is going to take care of himself. And we have to know our place and not to overstep our bounds. And that was what happened with Uzzah. The verse which describes Uzzah's death when he steadied the ark is constructed backwards from what I would think. It should say that the cattle shook the wagon and the ark became loose, and then Uzzah reached out his hand to steady it. But that's not what the verse says. The verse says Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark because the cattle had shaken it loose. In other words, the prophet is stressing the fact that Uzzah felt that he had the responsibility and the right to fix God, as it were. Now, the ark was not going to fall. It would never fall. The halacha is that the poles in the ark must remain in it at all times, even when it is at rest in the Holy of Holies. Why? It's not being carried then. The answer is, right, it's not being carried then. It's actually not being carried ever, because nobody carries the ark. It is the ark that carries us. It is the ark that carries the world. The ark is not going to fall. But Uzzah felt that it is the human role to help the divine in this world. And that was his mistake, and that was the mistake of Nadav and Avihu. They were too close, Bekorvatam lifnei Hashem. They were too close to God, and they were in the way when the fire came down. But Pinchas is coming not to fix God, but to fix the Jewish people. And for that, there is reward, because that is where we need to be active. That is where we cannot be passive. And that's exactly what Mordechai says to Esther. Esther, who knows if this is why you became the queen? Because you are in a position to fix, to save the Jewish people. So here you don't have the option of staying back. You must take a stand and do what is necessary. And then you will correct the sin of your great-great ancestor, King Saul, who Esther is descended from, who failed to slay Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He was passive. He should have been active. He should have taken care of that and gotten that plague out of existence. But because he didn't, Agag succeeded in keeping the line alive, and eventually Haman, who was a descendant of Agag, was here to destroy the Jewish people. And now Mordechai says to Esther, now is your chance to fix that sin. King Saul had a decree of disappearance upon him after this, that his family would be lost. You are the last chance to save that family. And if you miss it, that's why you will perish. And so Esther stood up and did the right thing. The moral of the story is, we should take great comfort, because God is running the world, and God will make sure that his people are safe and secure, and God will make sure that the prophecies of redemption will indeed come true. We should not be playing God, but our job is to be looking at Israel, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and seeing what do they need? What am I in a unique position to provide? How can I help? How can I do my part? And all of us doing that, that leaves the space open for God to then come and bring his divine presence back to the world and bring about the redemption. Shavuot Tov.